Welcome back to my course, World History. Today, we're going to continue our conversation we started last time about major ideologies that had been created in the modern age. So these ideologies were four major ideologies. The first three we discussed last time, and these were again classical liberalism, conservatism, and socialism. As I told you last time, today we are going to discuss the fourth major ideology. In fact, this ideology united more people, probably more people than the first three, because this ideology was for everybody, basically for all people who lived in a particular country. And this ideology is nationalism. So let me begin my presentation. In this case, I will have to take you to my PowerPoint presentation. Why nationalism? And how nationalism was related to what we had discussed before. Particularly, we talked about the Industrial Revolution and those modern changes that took place in Europe and eventually in the rest of the world. And that's when we need to make another link between what we're going to do today and what we discussed last time and the time before. Okay. First, let me outline what we mean by saying this ideology of nationalism. Ideology of nationalism is something that emerges in modern times with the rise of this industrial society, modernity, okay? When we have the decline of traditional church and religion, when we have the rise of science, when we have the new feeling among the people emerging, the feeling that they become the part of a same nation. It could be a French nation, a German nation, an American nation, okay? It's a sense of us against them. And of course, nationalism in modern age becomes something that mobilizes people. What makes nationalism? Nationalism, it's sort of imagined community that emerges in modern times. Why imagined community? This expression, imagined community, was introduced by the scholar named Benedict Anderson. Okay, and what he meant by saying this is that people in modern times, they imagine themselves as part of a same nation. I will give you an example for you to better understand. Okay, for example, you might live in Montana, okay, 2 miles away from the Canadian border. Across the international border, you know that you have people who are called Canadians, okay, and you might speak the same language, by the way, English language, unless there's some French Canadians. You might see the same programs on TV, okay. You might listen to the same radio. You might, in fact, I don't know how it goes now, but before all this Corona stuff and everything, you could have traveled across the border each month to visit your friends. Okay, but at the same time, you know that you went to a different school. You know that you live on the in the shade of the American flag, and you know that those people across the international border, they are Canadians who have the Canadian flag, who have the Canadian Constitution, who have the Canadian passports, Canadian citizenship, and on the map their country is colored in a different color, and it has different name, and they feel that they're Canadians, and you feel that you're an American. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to tell. That's what we mean when we say we mention this expression, an imagined community. So Americans, Canadians, French, Germans, Brits, it's something that people imagine in their own minds. For instance, you might be black, you might be Hispanic, you might be white, you might kind of argue with each other about all kind of political stuff, but you know that you're Americans, as long as you live in the United States, as long as you considered American citizens. Okay, most frequently you, despite the fact of your belonging to different races and cultures, you still have this sense of being Americans. Okay, and that's what we mean when we talk about so-called imagined communities. Okay, nationalism, as I said, naturally emerges as a result of the industrial revolution. And the third point right here, and the third point on my slide is very important. So please make a note of this third point, this third bullet point. Okay, it shows to you what it was, this link between the industrial revolution and the rise of these nations, imagined communities. So what prompted people, basically what prompted people to imagine themselves as parts of nations? Again, it didn't happen everywhere in the 19th century. And by the way, even in the present day, we still have some parts of the world where people still do not imagine themselves as parts of nations. Okay, if you go, for instance, to such remote corners, let's say Afghanistan or Papua New Guinea, or some, I don't know, remote areas of Amazon rainforest where you can see some tribes, they do not imagine, like in an Amazon rainforest, there are some tribes who don't know that they live in Brazil. They don't know the names of the president. They don't know that on the map, geographical map, this country called Brazil is colored in the same color. Why? Because they're totally excluded from the life of the nation. And again, it's only tiny spots, remote corners in the world. Okay, mostly in many current nations, people do feel as parts of the same nation. Okay, but now what prompted them in the 19th century? In the early 19th century, what prompted them to develop this feeling that they were the parts of the nations? And now we are turning to this most important thing. So look what happened during the Industrial Revolution. First, we have the old isolation of people from each other been gone, or predominantly been gone. Remember, the world of peasants and landlords in major European countries, of course, United States never had landlords and peasants because those colonists who came from Western Europe, they started from scratch, either buying lands from Indians or fighting against Indians and seizing the land, occupying the lands of Indians. So what is important here, that at the end of the 1700s and in the beginning of the 1800s, in the most advanced countries of the West, we have the old feudal order, traditional society, going down. The world of peasants, the world of landlords was going down, and instead of these people, we have new classes of people. We have workers, we have middle-class people, we have so-called bourgeoisie, merchants coming, dominating the life of the people. These classes of people even made revolutions. Remember, middle class revolutions in the United States and France and partial in England, the Glorious Revolution. So we have totally new groups of people. And what happens with these new groups of people? Look, people come to cities. Let's take these girls who came. Remember, we discussed the Industrial Revolution, and we talked about these young, unmarried girls who come to big cities to work under the same roof. Where? In textile factories. What do? They come, they speak with themselves in different dialects. They come from different parts of England. Remember, England was the pioneer of the Industrial Revolution. They come from different parts of England. And again, same things happen in other countries which had Industrial Revolution, countries of Northern Europe. And in these factories, they work together, a lot of them. And plus, when they go to have some good time somewhere on the weekends, okay, like even though these ladies had long working days, but still on weekend they could go to downtown and enjoy some city life, whatever. So they interacted with thousands of people who were coming from different parts of England. So what happened? They developed the sensation of being together, see, which peasants in the villages didn't have. So what Industrial Revolution did, it started to reshuffle people. It destroyed the old isolation of people from each other. So we have this migration into cities. And on top of this, we have what? We have railroads. Remember, railroads. Railroads, it's very important because railroads in all major European countries and the United States totally destroyed the old isolation of people. People started to travel from point A to point B in like 1-2 days. To travel from St. Louis to San Francisco in the second half of the United States, it took only a few days for people, okay? Right across the entire North American continent. So it hadn't happened before. On top of this, in the 1870s, 1880s, you have telegraph, okay? And plus, and what Benedict Anderson, by the way, this guy who came up with this expression, emergent communities, he also alerted us about so-called print culture. He said, look, guys, in the modern age, in the wake of Industrial Revolution or during the Industrial Revolution, you have a bunch of newspapers published in the most advanced countries, and people begin to read them, okay? Plus, in Northern Europe and United States, we have widespread literacy, and we know how literacy came to the life of Northwestern Europe. It's a link to the Reformation. We know about this by now, right? So anyway, in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, we have books, we have newspapers. You know, the books had been published even before the Industrial Revolution. Remember, the printing had been invented even before the Reformation. But during the Industrial Revolution, we have expansion of printing. Okay, printing was never popular as it had been prior to the Industrial Revolution. So we have wide groups of people who knew how to read and to write. They begin to read newspapers. Plus, what we have public education been introduced by major governments in Western countries. Almost in all Western countries, by the end of the 19th century, major Western countries like England, Germany, Italy, Spain, France, we have public education being introduced. What does it do, public education? It indoctrinates people. It plants in the minds of people certain ideas that they're supposed to believe through propaganda, through textbooks, okay? And one of the major pieces of this propaganda, it's cultivation of loyalty to a particular nation, okay? So people begin to share certain ideas of belonging to a same nation, American nation, French nation, okay, German nation. So what we need to remember is that in the wake of Industrial Revolution, we have the old isolation of traditional isolation, people from each other, been gone. And instead, we have communication, increased communication. People started to communicate more. They traded with each other more. They travel more. And they eventually developed this feeling of being parts of major nations. That's when we have major nations coming to dominate the life of people in Western countries. I repeat, first it had happened in major advanced industrial nations of the West. So we have these things which you can see right now on the slide, contributing to what? To the development of nationalism. We have uniform standards, measures, weights, money being introduced during 19th century. Standard languages, because people need to read by using standard languages. Mass newspapers, I mentioned this. And uniform public school education, of course, I just mentioned it. And what I forgot to mention to you is the military draft, okay? Except the United States, in all major Western nations, we have military draft being introduced, and plus Japan too, because Japan also, even though she is an Asian nation, we can consider it was becoming one of the Western nations, advanced nation. So we have in all these major advanced countries a military draft being introduced to do what? To protect a nation. Okay. What I'm going to do right now, I'm going to pick up 3 countries to show you how this formation of nationalism was taking place in the 19th century, in the wake or during the Industrial Revolution. And the first country I would like to mention is Italy. Italy, before 1870, when she became united in a country named Italy in her present borders, it was a bunch of small kingdoms, independent kingdoms. You can see on this map a bunch of these small kingdoms. I'm not going even to mention the names, okay? You don't need, you have too many names anyway. But one of the most developed kingdoms, Italian kingdoms, was so-called Piedmont, okay? And what happened? These people who lived in these kingdoms, from Sicily to Piedmont, they were speaking the same dialect, okay? Oh, I'm sorry, they were speaking same dialects. There was no standard Italian language yet. They simply were speaking similar dialects, okay? And what was going on? They were threatened by neighboring countries like France. They also watched how Germans were working to unite themselves. We will be talking about Germany in a few minutes, okay? And they said, hey, we need to do the same, because if, for instance, France expands, that might conquer us, okay? Germany also is taking efforts to unite herself. They might take us over. Plus, we speak same dialects anyway, so let's make ourselves more powerful by being united in a unified state, okay? But look what they did in order to get united into the same state, okay? One of the major politicians, Italian politicians, he was in fact the prime minister of Piedmont, named Camillo Cavour. He was the father of Italian unification, okay? He was working for the king. Piedmont had a king, so under his king, he was his prime minister. So he used this kingdom of Piedmont, the most advanced industrial state in Italy, as a core around which other Italian states were united, okay? And the most important thing for us to remember in this respect is his efforts to do what? To promote railroad building. So basically, he was interested in railroads to do what? To glue Italy together, because he realized that if they built a railroad from north to southmost part of Italy, Sicily, the country would be united, okay? And that's what he promoted. So let's get united, and the railroad would connect us. We would create the common market. We would travel, so everything would be fine. So he made a big deal about railroads. That's one of the reasons, by the way, why I picked up Italy, because I wanted to show you how important it is to remember this link between the formation of nations and the Industrial Revolution. So here we have the kingdom, Piedmont, that artificially from up above decided to build a railroad because industry was most important thing, what to serve as the foundation for the would-be Italian nation. Of course, in such countries like England, like Sweden, to some extent France, we already had the Industrial Revolution being developed from down below, right? And these countries became very powerful. And the northern United States also became powerful because industry was developing from down below by these free entrepreneurs, okay, who took advantage of this free system, political freedoms, especially UK, of course, UK, Sweden, United States, okay, Northern Europe, Netherlands. But Italy, that was a southern Catholic country where we don't have enough educated people. Remember the Catholic parts of Europe, okay, Spain, Portugal, Italy. People felt they would be threatened by Northern Europeans who could conquer them. They decided to build up industry purposely to serve, to empower themselves, to unite themselves. That's how Italians used industry to unite themselves. See, very important. So next country which I'm going to talk about, by the way, before I switch to the next country, look what I wrote for you here. Okay, it's an interesting comment made by Cavour on the role of railroads. The primary psychological effect of the establishment of railroads on the Italian peninsula is so great that it should be enough to justify the enthusiasm railroads arouse among all the true friends of Italy. A communication system permitting the constant movement, take a note of this, constant movement of persons in all directions must necessarily connect populations once strangers to each other, and should contribute much to the destruction of petty municipal rivalries born of ignorance and prejudice, unquote. It's a very powerful statement. So it tells us a lot about this link between the Industrial Revolution and the rise of nationalism. Okay. So Italy was united in 1870, and this guy, Giuseppe Garibaldi, military commander, he capitalized on the situation that railroad building, that this aspirations among many Italians to get united. Okay, so this guy assisted the other guy. So Giuseppe Garibaldi had 1,000 people who went through Italy, making sure that some of the petty princes would agree with this general will, so to speak. Again, that's another important thing for any nationalism. That's sensation of the great will. Okay, it's very important. Next, what I'm going to bring to your attention is Germany. One of the best examples of nationalism is Germany and how nationalism was developed. Okay. By the way, like Italy, Germany was also get united in same year, almost same year. So Italy became a united country in 1870, Germany in 1871. Germany had represented a bunch of independent kingdoms. Okay, right now you can see a map, the map that actually doesn't show you how it was in 1830s, 1840s. Okay, it shows you, by the way, Germany on the eve of unification, which already had like 5 big states that eventually brought themselves together into a country that accepted this name of Germany. But if you go before 1860s, you will see more states. Okay, so you have a bunch of independent states. I think at some point there were 48 Germanic states, but the biggest among them was Prussia. Prussia, it's Eastern Germanic state. And unlike many other Europeans, Germans were so disunited, but at the same time they spoke similar dialects. And when Napoleon invaded the Germanic kingdoms in 1807, he quickly defeated them one by one. And that's what upset Germans. They said, hey, we speak the same dialects, but we are threatened. We were threatened by one guy, and he quickly conquered all of us. Okay. And many Germans, even before the Industrial Revolution started, they raised this issue that we need to get together. But there was no way for them to get together because there were no industrial glues. There were no industrial kind of devices to bring them together. They didn't have yet railroads before the Industrial Revolution. Like in 1810, 1820, they didn't have yet the railroads. They didn't have telegraph, right? They hardly had any newspapers, nationwide newspapers. But some Germanic intellectuals already raised this issue that we speak the same dialects and we need to get united. And I would like to bring to your attention one name, Grimm brothers, okay? Famous fairy tale collectors. You probably heard about them. They collected a bunch of Germanic fairy tales. And they, by the way, composed the first dictionary of German language, 1838, okay? Why did they collect Germanic fairy tales? You probably read some of these Grimm brothers fairy tales. Remember such stories like Rumpelstiltskin? Okay, I don't remember any others. That's the first that comes to my mind. But anyway, you can Google Grimm brothers and you will see that they did a lot for German culture. They were famous for collecting fairy tales. But what you might not find in these Wikipedia articles when you go to read about Grimm brothers or some other encyclopedia articles, what you will not see is the information that they were driven not only by a natural curiosity, they were driven by a national cause, the national Germanic cause, by collecting fairy tales from different parts of Germany, the country that was disunited. They essentially wanted to send a message to all German-speaking people who spoke similar dialects but who politically were disunited. Hey guys, we have the same culture. We have the same fairy tales. Yes, they might be different, like in Bavaria, southern German country. In Bavaria, in Prussia, we might have different types of fairy tales, Rumpelstiltskin, but still it's basically the same story, the same fairy tale. So we have similar dialects, similar fairy tales. Why don't we get together, okay, as a country? Here's the picture of Grimm brothers. The person who brought Germans together was so-called Iron Chancellor, a prime minister. That's a title of prime minister in Germany is Chancellor. So, for example, present day Angela Merkel, you heard the name of it. She's a chancellor, which means prime minister. At that time, there was a prime minister of the biggest Germanic state called Prussia, and his name was Otto von Bismarck. So he became known as the Iron Chancellor, the Iron Prime Minister. So he is considered the architect of modern Germany. He was a die-hard nationalist. He wanted to bring all Germans together, and he uttered this famous phrase, which is very much meaningful. He said on one occasion that I'm going to unite Germany by iron and blood. It's a very powerful expression and very meaningful. Why? Because in this expression you will see two things. Iron and blood. So what did he mean by say iron and blood? Some people believe that by say iron and blood he meant iron and the force of weapon. And indeed, he became a notorious militarist. He provoked wars. I will mention in a couple of minutes that he did provoke wars. Why? Because he realized, which by the way all politicians know, that a small war is the best way to bring people together. Or for instance, if you're in trouble, if something happens, the best way to distract people's attention is a small war. And a war is the great thing to glue people together. Okay, so if you conduct wars, people tend to get mobilized, and that was his idea. Yes, definitely he wanted to use military power, iron. Okay, and blood. It's also blood. What does it mean, blood? Blood. It means all Germans who by blood belong to the same nation. So he wanted to bring them together. Plus, blood might mean what he was ready to spill the blood in order to bring Germans together. But it's only one part, one side of this expression, or at least one way to interpret this expression. Another way to interpret this expression is to put emphasis on the word iron, which means industry. I'm going to build industry. I'm going to encourage the construction of factories, construction of railroads. Okay? I'm going to encourage metal industry, iron industry. See? Iron. It's a very symbolic. So there are two ways to think about this expression. As I said, Bismarck, since Germans were so independent, they were speaking the same dialects, but it was hard for them to bring themselves together because each Germanic prince believed that he was a big shot. Everybody wanted to be a king. But Bismarck had this idea, grand idea, that it was to be Prussia, the biggest Germanic state that would bring all Germanic kingdoms together. And that's exactly what happened. Okay. First thing, he provoked an Austro-Prussian war, which Prussia won. He said, you Austrians, you speak the same dialect. Austrians were part of Austro-Hungary Empire. Austro-Hungary Empire. It's a multi-ethnic, multilingual empire in southeastern part of Europe. Okay, and Austrians were like calling shots in this empire, and the German language was the official language of this empire. He said, why don't you join us? We need to be together. We're German-speaking people. Austrians refused to do it, so he provoked war. He did defeat Austrians. Even though he wasn't able to conquer and destroy the entire empire, still Austrians were defeated, and that's what brought northern Germanic states together. This war, he invited northern Germanic states to participate in this war against Austrians. Oh, these bastards don't want to be together with us, German-speaking people. So we are going to penalize them. So he used this war to bring northern Germanic states together. Then he provoked another war against France. Remember, I told you, Napoleon had defeated Germanic states when? In 1807. Okay? And it was like a huge humiliation for Germans. So Bismarck now provoked the war, literally attacked French. I'm not going into details, we don't have time. So he basically manufactured an excuse and sent German troops against French. But he invited the rest of the Germanic states. Now we have southern Germanic states, Bavaria and other Germanic states joining the same campaign against French people. And look what happened. In 1870, a united German army enters France, defeats the French troops. Germans occupied Paris, the capital of France. And in Paris, the capital of France, in Paris. Otto von Bismarck and the Prussian king, William I, they come and declare what? The unification of Germany. See, in Paris, the capital of the conquered country, they defeated France. Germans declared their unification. So the war opened the doors to this unification. But, I repeat, there was something else had been done without which it would have been hard for Bismarck to bring Germanic people together. What did he do? First, even before Bismarck became Prussian Chancellor and then German Chancellor. By the way, he became the Chancellor of this united country called Germany after 1871. What had happened even before Bismarck became the Chancellor of Germany, Germanic states concluded an agreement to eliminate customs barriers in order to increase the trade. And then railroads were built, factories. People started to travel, workers, middle-class people. The first railroads, bringing people from point A to point B, as I said. So there was a lot of infrastructure being built that contributed to what Bismarck was doing. So like uniting Germans together. Okay. And finally, I'm going to bring to your attention the United States. The United States. It's an interesting country, even though we live in the United States. But why is it an interesting country? Because the United States had been formed on the basis of the lack of the common territory, lack of common language. Originally there was no common culture, no common language, no common territory, because the United States was still an expanding nation in the 19th century, right? There was hardly any American nationalism. In fact, there was no American nationalism. This revolution of 1776, when this revolution won, there were 13 colonies, which were like independent nations, independent republics, right? 13 colonies. And these colonies didn't think about themselves as Americans, okay? Because each state, 13 colonies or 13 states, each state wanted to be like an independent country, okay? By the way, I want to mention something. You might not know this, okay? That at least until the 1830s, or better to say, until, let's say, 1860s, on many occasions, Americans referred to their country in plural. For example, the United States are, the United States were, okay? Which shows that there was not yet the sense of American nationalism. There was not yet the sense of belonging to the same country. It was a very vague, fluid nation, okay? There were hardly any national holidays, right? Like Thanksgiving. Yeah, there were no Thanksgiving. Until what? Until the middle of the 1800s. It was not widespread. There was no baseball game for the entire United States, okay? So there were no symbols. On the map, there was not yet a nation colored in the same color. In fact, in the West, there was just empty spot, like we're expanding, there's no fixed border, okay? And indeed, the United States, let me show you. Yeah, here's the map, see? It shows this manifest destiny. That's expansion of the United States further and further. So until 1867, there was no fixed territory in the United States. So there was no way even to paint, to color this nation in one color on the map, okay? But gradually new territories had been purchased, like Louisiana. Then there was a war Mexican-American War. And by the way, war, as I said, was one of the best ways to bring people together, and that's what contributed to this formation of the American nation, American-Mexican War, when the Americans took over this huge chunk of land from Mexico. Of course, you may hear that present day some Mexican people say, hey, it's our land. I always laugh, because in such cases I said, okay, you are saying it's your land, but what about Native Americans? so in this case, you should give it to the Native Americans. Okay, but again, if we give this land to Native Americans, who are these Native Americans? Because there were some Native Americans who lived here before other Native American tribes here. So, which shows that if we begin to settle historical scores, we'll be involved in the eternal fight forever. We'll never be able to reach an agreement. So that is why any historical dispute, who owes something to somebody, it's a very dangerous thing. It's a slippery slope, okay? Because you always can argue that, oh, it belongs to me, and another tribe comes, no, it belongs to me. So anyway, just small remark on the margins. The United States, I'm going to back to the major thing what I was discussing. The United States was still an open-end project, an open project. So 1848, the Mexican-American War, this huge chunk was added to the American territory. Then Oregon territory was ceded by the Brits, and something else you cannot see here, but it's important. In 1867, the American government purchased Alaska, okay, Alaska territory from the Russian Empire, because the Russian Empire didn't have resources to control this land, remote land. So Americans purchased it, and that was the end. That was the end. So finally, the American territory was shaped. So at first, I repeat, Americans referred to themselves in plural. The United States were, the United States are, and it's related to the sense of decentralization when these 13 states, the first states, did not yet have this feeling that they were part of the same nation. But gradually this feeling did develop. Not overnight, of course, gradually. So eventually Americans started to think about themselves as us against them. Like, for example, when England from Canada attacked Washington, D.C., like a small capital of the country in 1812, okay? Americans were able to fight back, and that's when the American anthem was written, okay? See, it's one of the major symbols of nationalism, an anthem, national anthem. So gradually, step by step, Americans started feeling that they were part of the same nation. Another major thing is the Civil War, okay? Whatever I said about Americans referring to themselves in plural, was still widespread before the Civil War. And in fact, even though we have northern states developing this feeling that they were part of the United States, still before the Civil War, country was sharply divided in two parts. There was no yet sensation that people who lived in the United States thought about themselves as Americans, okay? Because in southern states, they developed their own identity. They even spoke a different dialect. They had a different culture. They had different economic system, as we know, based on slavery. In northern part of the country, we have a different economic system based on free labor. We have a different dialect being spoken, right? Different culture. So in northern states, factory labor, factories were widespread in cities. Free farmers wanted to occupy western lands, okay? They were interested in free labor. They didn't need slavery. But southern slave owners wanted to expand to the west by bringing their plantations, and that's what eventually provoked this Kansas conflict in Kansas, 1854, as you know, the fight between farmers, northern farmers, and southern slave owners, which eventually opened the doors to the Civil War. Again, I'm not going into details because everybody knows the history of the Civil War. What I'm interested in here in that how the Civil War contributed to the rise of American nationalism. Okay. The southern states, remember when they seceded from the United States, using their specific culture, economy based on slavery, in addition to major goal to defend slavery because northern states were against slavery, there was a secondary issue, so-called state rights. They said we secede because it's our right. Okay, but North said no, we are the same nation. So basically, it was fight about the slavery and a fight about the nation. So are we going to have the nation, the same unified nation, or not? Okay. So South had a backward economy, so there was no industry in the South. Why? Because this part of the country was based on slave labor. Okay, there were fewer railroads. There were few, but very few compared to northern states, as you know. There were hardly any factories. The only place in the South that had a bit of industry and railroads around this was Richmond. Richmond, right? The other parts of South were underdeveloped. Subsistence farming or slave plantations, okay? Unlike North, where we have factories, a lot of factories, because northern United States was quickly becoming one of the advanced areas of the globe, in addition to England and Netherlands, okay? Railroads, free labor, free farming. So it was the fight of North against the South. It was the fight of two ways of life. There's modern life, northern states, and so-called old life, feudal, traditional society, because Southerners made a big deal about this traditional society, okay, this particular ways of behavior, you know, and it was a big deal, okay, at that time. So there was a fight between the two ways of life, this industrial capitalist and southern traditional feudal, okay, based on slavery. And of course, since the northern part had a more advanced economy, in fact, northern soldiers were not as skilled as southern soldiers, because cultural warfare was cultivated among southerners, okay? In northern states, there was no culture that cultivated war, gentlemen's warfare, okay, this type, dueling, and all this stuff. But still, the sheer number of people who lived in northern states, the sheer number of soldiers, the sheer amount of industry northern armies brought to this war totally overwhelmed the southern industrial potential, which was hardly there, as we know. There was hardly any industrial potential in the South. Ironically, the only source of guns, cannons, and supplies, industrial supplies for South, was the only reliable source was England, UK. It's the irony of the situation, because England was one of the most progressive countries in the world, but England was afraid of a competition of the United States. So it was profitable for them to keep the backward South. The United States was expected to be divided because it was good for England. So in this case, England could benefit from this, like using the southern states as the source of raw materials, cotton. So English textile industry could capitalize on southern cotton economy. So England, that's where the irony of the situation, progressive England to some extent was interested in supporting southern states against northern states, because England didn't need highly advanced United States to compete with the UK. Okay, so southern states that seceded from the Union, they could rely on England. But even in this case, of course, it was hard to provide help across the Atlantic Ocean. Again, the point I'm trying to make is that from a viewpoint of industrial development, the southern states were not a match to the northern states. Okay, so northern states were able to conduct this war successfully, and using their industrial potential, so they were eventually able to defeat southern states, because they outgunned southerners, because they had more guns, more cannons, more trains, more railroads, more soldiers, okay, more everything. So when northern states defeated southern states, Confederacy, what was it? It was the unification of the United States. So eventually the entire country became united, and now we don't have United States being referred in plural. We have the United States is, United States were, United States would be. As I said, it's a usage, the new usage. So the Americans, people who lived in the United States, they started more and more thinking about themselves as Americans after this war. So the Civil War was like a crucible of the American nation, okay? And one of the symbols of this American nationalism, formation of the American nation, was the Union Pacific Railroad. Everybody heard about it, right? Union Pacific Railroad. Before the Civil War, there was no Southerners and Northerners could not agree about building a railroad to the West. Everybody wanted, realized that we need to connect the Western coast with the East by railroad. But Northerners and Southerners argued about where we were going to have this railroad. Southerners insisted on this railroad being built in the South, from southern states to the West, through Texas and to California, okay? So southern states, right along the Mexican border, along the Mexican border. But Northerners insisted about this railroad being built through northern states, okay? Through Illinois and northern plains to California, okay? And they couldn't, there was no agreement. But when the war was over, what was done? The railroad was finally built. Union Pacific Railroad. And by the way, if you look at the map, look at this map. It went not here, as Southerners suggested it should go here. Northerners suggested it would be going here, right? It went right through the middle of the United States, right through the middle. So one team of construction team started in St. Louis, here in Mississippi, in the Mississippi River. Another one in San Francisco, and they were going, and they were building this Union Pacific Railroad, and eventually they met each other in Utah, Salt Lake City, okay? That's where this happened, when the two teams met each other. The Golden Pike was hammered, okay, in the rails, and the country was linked together. That's the most important. It's a very symbolic. Why am I telling you all this stuff? Why am I telling you this stuff? The reason I'm telling you this stuff is to kind of show you the link between the politics, industrial revolution, and nationalism. This the most popular ideology in the modern world, nationalism. Okay, so you have here the Union Pacific Railroad that was completed by 1869. The railroad that united two parts of the country, eastern part and western part. The railroad that had not been built before the Civil War. Why? Because before the Civil War, there was not yet there this feeling among the people of being part of the American nation. But after the Civil War, it became possible to build this railroad. And it was built. And it was something like this industrial glue that linked two parts of the country together, and people could travel. It was a matter of days to come from St. Louis to San Francisco, from San Francisco to St. Louis. A few days. So now we already have the United States becoming a nation. And that's when people more and more started thinking about themselves. Hey, we're Americans. So now we have this imagined community of Americans. And that's when the Thanksgiving comes, this baseball game, certain holidays, certain habits, traditions, customs, which can be called American customs, okay? See, that's how the Industrial Revolution and the nationalism were connected to each other, okay? And on this note, let me interrupt myself, and I will see you next time.